Okay, I'm going to go ahead and start. I think everybody's had a good opportunity to jump in here, and I appreciate your attendance. This session is going to cover color management. And for me, color management isn't really a topic that is just important. It's an obsession and a passion because I think it's an opportunity for you to differentiate yourself, among other things, from your competition. And the bottom line is most of you, all of you are doing printing, and all of you want your printed output to look better than the competition. So what I'm going to do is really go over some topics to help you ensure that you have proper color management, and as a result of that, better finished products. Now, the challenge is, I'm sure the people that are in attendance are in different levels of experience, not in your work, but the life of your shop or business. So some of you are brand new, some of you are experienced, some have been around a while. So some of the things I'm going to talk about involve settings in the design program, settings in the production program, and believe me, the settings that I am going to recommend will provide changes to the end result. I propose these to experienced existing owners, and they come back and they say, wow, you know, I reprinted a job or two and everything changed. And that is going to happen if you adhere to what I'm going to provide you. It's an overall benefit. But for existing locations, there is a little bit of a pain point when you're dealing with jobs that you have done pre-recommendations on color settings versus those that you do post scenarios. I'm going to, as I did earlier with the RGB presentation, be working through a PowerPoint presentation. And so, again, I'm not quite as nifty as I should be on this, but I'm going to go ahead and share my desktop. Oh, and bring up the right program. Okay. Okay, and go into color management basics. And again, this is an overview of what I believe you should be doing. And for me, color management involves two things. It involves optimizing your system, optimizing the software, optimizing the hardware, and then creating consistency. And if you look under consistency, I've got that listed as the opposite of insanity. And I like this quote because the preconceived definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting something different. With consistency in color management, it's doing the same thing over and over again and expecting the same results. And when I get calls from owners who say, yeah, you know what, I printed something yesterday and I printed it today and it looks different. Well, if everything was the same, the result would be the same. And that's a challenge with supporting that, because it's a matter of finding out what's different. Is it the state of the printer that's different? Is it the profile? Something has changed, because if you maintain consistency and do the same thing every time, the same job will be able to get the same result multiple times. As far as the settings, and I apologize for this, you know, I threw these together and hopefully you can see this, but on the design side, in Illustrator and in Photoshop, in order to assign proper color settings, you will go to the Edit drop-down menu, down to an option for color settings. So in Illustrator, in Photoshop, the beauty of Adobe is the fact that there's consistency. So color settings in Illustrator are found in the Edit drop-down in color settings. and color settings in Photoshop are found in the same place. And what I've got here, and this session is going to be recorded, as every session is recorded. But what I have there is a list of every setting that I would recommend in Adobe Illustrator. So in the working spaces, I talked earlier about setting RGB to Adobe 1998. Everything defaults to sRGB, and I recommend changing that to Adobe 1998, because if you're working in RGB, you have a larger gamut to work with. CMYK always defaults to swap. We're going to leave that alone. And under color management policies, we want to preserve the embedded profiles. If clients are giving you a file and they've taken the time to link the color settings to that file, then we want to make sure that we honor the client's color. So when we're preserving embedded profiles, what we're doing is maintaining any color information that a client has given you. And if you notice under color management policies, I've got checks when mismatches come up. And honestly, that can be kind of a pain, because when you open up a file, you get a message. And you get a message if there's a mismatch saying you may be working in one color setting or one working space, and you're getting a file in another one. Or you may be working in a particular working space and they don't have any color information assigned to it. I find the pop-ups on this to be very valuable, because it gives you the information that there is something not quite right with what the client has given you. If you don't get a message, it means that the working spaces that you have assigned have been matched by what the client is giving you. But if not, this pops up. And if there's a mismatch, if you're working, for instance, in Adobe 1998, and they give you a file in sRGB, you want to make sure that you preserve that profile and use sRGB. If there's something that you get a message that says there's no color information on this file, the interesting thing is one of the options is to not color manage, to just say ignore this and forget about it, which is impossible. Illustrator, Photoshop, they're going to color manage. So when you select don't color manage, it's still going to color manage. But what I recommend is shifting that to an option that you're assigning a working space. You're assigning swap. You're assigning Adobe RGB. But those only come up when you have these check boxes checked. Try it, see how it works. If it's a pain, I mean, turn them off. They come up every time you open a file where there's a mismatch, but I like to have that information. I like to have that knowledge. And as far as conversion options at the bottom, notice you see intent as the bottom drop-down menu, and it's set to relative color metric. I talked about rendering intents in the last class, but it's rules and regulations for taking out of gamut color and shifting it in gamut. And we want to make sure it's set to relative color metric in Illustrator, because that properly deals with vector color. Now, the beauty of it is Illustrator defaults to relative color metric, so you don't have to make that change. I don't have a Photoshop screen up here, but what I would say is, in addition to making sure the RGB is set to Adobe 1998, in addition to preserving embedded profiles, you want to go down to intent and change that from relative color metric to something called perceptual. Perceptual rendering intent works best with images and photographs, which is what Photoshop is going to be dealing with. Okay, so really on the design side, that's all you have to do. I will tell you, however, experience has shown me that when you update Illustrator, and we all know that the annual updates for Illustrator are earth-shattering. There's tools and stuff in Illustrator that you've never seen before, and I'm being facetious. Really, an annual update, in my opinion, doesn't do a whole lot. I haven't seen a whole lot of difference in the last 3 versions of Illustrator. And maybe that's because I don't use it all the time. I don't know. But when you upgrade Illustrator, when you upgrade Photoshop, it's loading a new program, you're installing a new version, and the settings that I showed you will not update. So you can set these and forget them in a day-to-day scenario, but when you upgrade the program, you want to go back in and verify that those settings are correct and change and update those if necessary. And that's really all you have to do on the design side. On the production side, it's a little bit different. Now, I'm going to assume we've got 35 people in here roughly, that most, if not all of you, are working in Onyx. And as far as Onyx is concerned, color information is part of an overall scheme called a quickset. Most of you probably know this. Some of you may not know this. But as far as setting up quicksets, I have a display here of the quicksets that I would recommend. Now, I've seen and talked to some people who have a quickset for every media, and I think that's kind of overkill. Again, I'm all about color management, and I'm all about reducing the moving parts. So what you see there on the quickset tab is you see 3 listed. You see default, which basically installs with the program. I wish you could get rid of it. I wish you could delete it, but the entire file structure of Onyx breaks down so they don't allow you to delete that. But in my opinion, the number of times or frequency you should use the default quickset is never. Instead, set up a quickset for each workflow through Onyx. If you're cutting vinyl, and again, I'm talking about printing and or cutting. If you're cutting vinyl, you're going to go directly out of Illustrator, likely to Cutting Master. That would be my recommended workflow. But anything to do with printing, which involves straight printing or printing and cutting, I recommend going out of Onyx. So for the quick sets, I'm going to set up a quick set for each of those workflows. The difference between print and cut is on print and cut, I have defined a cutter and it will print out registration marks that my cutter understands. For color information, it's going to be identical. For color information, we're going to deal with print files the same as we do print and cut files. And so in here, the main thing we're going to shift, the main thing we're going to adjust is found in that change profiles window. And there's a drop-down arrow, but I'm going to recommend you don't use that drop-down arrow, that you click directly on the button Change Profiles. And again, if you haven't set your Onyx up this way, I would highly recommend you do it, but with the caveat that jobs you've already printed, if you're bringing those in again, you're going to have color settings that are going to be different and adjustments that need to be made. So this might be my only recommendation to using the default quickset. If you set these up correctly, you can use the default quickset on jobs you're reprinting, at least jobs prior or pre-setting up these proper color settings, and then use the print and cut post-change. So anything you do from that point forward, use the print and cut quicksets. But the color information for these 2 quicksets are found in the Change Profiles area. And again, you're going to click on Configure Printer. It's grayed out at the top there, but you're going to click Configure Printer, and it's going to bring up the Configure Printer dialog box. You're going to go to the right side and click New to create a new profile. And what you're going to do is you're going to name it something you can recognize, print for print jobs, print and cut for print and cut jobs, and go into Change Profiles and address the color settings within Onyx. So in this case, when I click on Change Profiles, this window is going to come up. And when this window comes up, the settings that I recommend in the Profile tab are displayed here, similar to the settings that I displayed in Illustrator and in Photoshop. And so for CMYK image and vector, we're going to leave it alone as web-coded swap. For RGB image and vector, Adobe 1998. And that provides consistency with the design programs to the production program, and that's what we want. We want a consistent management or handling of color as we pass off these files from program to program and ultimately print those on the printer. And again, with most of you, that's the HP latex. So in this particular case, we want to make sure we use the embedded profile and make sure that the CMYK and RGB are set up correctly. Notice under custom image, no profile is selected. We're going to leave that alone. So under the Profile tab, this is what should be set up. Now, when we talked about, or I talked about rendering intents in Illustrator and Photoshop, there was basically one option. You either selected relative colorimetric for Illustrator, or you selected perceptual for Photoshop. Rendering intents are handled a little bit differently within Onyx. And again, a rendering intent to review a model to shift colors from out of gamut to in gamut. So within Onyx, it actually breaks it down into 4 quadrants. Not just CMYK and RGB, but CMYK image, RGB image, CMYK vector, and RGB vector. And they're going to default to, I believe, all just being perception. And, you know, again, that's going to shift color in certain instances incorrectly, out of gamut to in gamut. So what I recommend is for each of the 2 images, CMYK and RGB, you set those to perceptual with black point compensation. And on the older versions of Onyx, you don't have these drop downs, but you do have a checkbox that says use black point compensation. So in any method with any version, you want to make sure black point compensation is selected to properly create a rendering intent that is accurate. As far as lab image, I set that to relative colorimetric. For those of you who I've talked to and have used it, when we're matching colors, we're going to measure those in a lab environment within the Onyx program. And we want to make sure it's set up as relative colorimetric to do that. So for the profiles, we want to set it up in this manner. Moving back one more, we want to name it something accurate, something we can identify that involves the workflow we're going to be using. And the key here is making sure that the color settings in the design and the production program match. When we get color shifts, when we get mismatches, it's because the color is handed off incorrectly from program to program. It's like a relay race. You know, racer number 1 hands a baton to racer number 2, who hands a baton to racer number 3. And if that works smoothly, then they win the race. If it doesn't and somebody drops the baton, there's problems. And if you don't have consistent color settings in both the design and the production program, you're dropping the baton. So we want to make sure we have consistency all the way through there. Okay. On the latex printer, this is an opportunity for you to kind of have a say in color management. What I've shown you up to this point is really fixed settings. So it's not a matter of, oh, you know, use setting A in this scenario, setting B in this scenario. Color settings are color settings. But when it comes to the latex printer, you've got some control. And color management is management. And so you want to be in charge of that. And with the printer, you get that opportunity. So my recommendation to advance color management is to create your own profiles. Now notice I say create your own profiles when possible, because it's not always possible. A couple of the challenges in working with the HP latex and the I1 spectrophotometer that is on the printer is dealing with textured material. The flatter it is, the easier it works. The more textured it is, the more challenging it is. So what's the advantage of creating your own profiles? And I'm going to open this up, and I may be sorry, that I do this, but I'd like to hear from anyone what you think the advantage of creating your own media profiles is. Or nobody? No one knows? Okay. I guess that's why you're here. Oh, wait. Okay. Well, I'll go ahead and describe it, mainly because I don't think I can get to the chat window when I'm sharing my screen full screen. So there's two benefits to creating profiles on your printer. One is it's on your equipment. It's not on somebody else's equipment in some other environment. And that may seem petty, it may seem picky, but there is an advantage to using your own equipment. Call it a home field advantage. It's your printer in your environment. So that's one benefit. The other is if someone else is creating a profile, then they're setting the terms of that profile. You want to try and create as saturated an environment as you can. And I know people who create third-party profiles. I've been one of those people. And in some cases, if I have to do 20 profiles, I'm not fine-tuning, I'm not trying to get the best result. I'm trying to get an acceptable result. But if we're proposing the fact that color management is a difference maker, the difference maker for you is to be able to control that saturation and thus control the gamut. So creating profiles on your own printer means you're working on your own equipment, it's more accurate, and creating profiles on your own printer means that you can control the scenario, control the factors and variables. Both of those are very important. And the tough part is, I have proposed in the past that you create a profile and you have to create it one time for every new media you use, and then you don't have to create a profile again. And while that is technically correct, what happens over time is that the state of your printer changes. When you replace print heads, when you replace cartridges, though it's subtle, the actual state of the printer is going to shift from where it was. So anytime you're replacing something, it's going to be a little bit different. And one of the things with the HP printer that I like, that I propose, that I embrace, is the fact that it is a very intelligent machine. It can keep track of ink, maybe not with 100% accuracy, but pretty close. And it can keep track of print heads, very close. It keeps track of all kinds of things, including the state of the printer relative to every profile that is assigned to every media that you are using. So if you notice on the subcategory there, the status of the profile and really the calibration of the profile is found in every situation in the substrate window. In the substrate window, you're going to find a lot of information. The type of material you're using, if you use length tracking, but at the bottom is something called color calibration. And that's extremely important moving forward to maintain a consistent color management workflow. So I'm going to give you some examples of the state of the HP latex and the 3 different states that the profile can be in. When you first create a profile, and during a period of time, what you're going to find is that the color calibration is okay. And I apologize profusely. Hopefully everybody can see this. This is what happens when your digital camera has a problem and you have to take photos with an iPhone 6. So, I apologize for this. Hopefully everybody can see it. I'm Mr. Tech. That's why I've got, an iPhone that's what, 5 versions old. But nonetheless, I like it because it works. It just doesn't take photos as well as the newer versions. So in this particular case, notice at the bottom, this particular media I had just created. So I knew it was brand new, and I knew if you look at color calibration, it's okay, which means that the state of the printer relative to the state of the profile is within specs to be able to create an accurate result. Okay, so that is option number one. But as time goes by and more things happen with the printer goes out of center a little more. And as far as the color calibration and recalibrating, I really consider that a tune-up for the media profile. And for those of you who create profiles or have created profiles, there's 3 steps. You're going to assign the saturation level. You're going to assign the pass count. You're going to assign the heat. And then once you've done that, it's going to go through to step number 2, which is color calibration, and step number 3, which is ICC profile. So I'm going to get into that in just a minute, but the first state that your calibration can be in is an OK status or OK state, and that's in the substrate window. The second one is something that says recommended, which means that the printer has begun to shift. The result of printing on that media with the current state of the printer will be adequate, but it's not going to be optimal. So you might see colors that you're matching shift a little bit. Comparing one to the other, they're not exact. And we've seen, I don't want to say a degradation of the printer, but just more a shifting of the printer away from the state it was in when you created that profile. And that should be addressed, in my opinion. If it's recommended that you do a color calibration, then I would do a color calibration. And this is the one scenario where perhaps you take a proactive approach. I'm all about reactive. Problems with the printer, let's see what's wrong. And you don't have to create a scenario where you have recommended proactive maintenance on the printer. But this is something where I might provide an exception. And that's going through and verifying that the medias you're working with regularly still show a color calibration that is in the OK status. You can do that without actually having to physically load the material to find out. Just whatever media you have in, change it to something else, take a look on the substrate, and see where the color calibration recommendation is. It's either OK, or as we see here, recommended that you recalibrate, or the dreaded obsolete. What we find in obsolete is that in the HP recommendation, the printer in its current state is not in an adequate enough state to provide acceptable results with the current profile as is. So when we get a situation where you recalibrate, whether it's recommended, whether it's obsolete, what we're doing is bringing the profile in line with the current state of the printer. And I highly recommend it for optimal results to make sure that color calibration setting or summary is always in the OK state. It's not going to change usually if you create a profile and change a print head. But over time, it's going to shift out of an OK status into a status that you need to address, in my opinion. So how do we do that? And the answer is actually it can be done in one of two places. And the color calibration is going to take steps 2 and 3 in the profiling process. Color calibrating, printing, drying, measuring. ICC profile creation, which are all those patches it measures, printing, drying, calibrating. So there's very little that you need to do as far as interaction other than advance the process. On the printer itself, and again, I worked this off a 360. 360s, 365s, they're in a little bit different place. Actually, in the 365, I think you can find it on the main screen. It's a color management area there. Here with the 360, you've got to delve in a little bit deeper. And again, this reiterates what I said. It's the final 2 steps of the profiling process: color calibration and ICC profile creation. Within the 360, image quality maintenance, that's what I was looking at. On the 365, I think there's a front panel button for that. But on the 360, you'll go into settings, go into image quality maintenance. Now, in this particular case, obviously, you have to have the media that you're calibrating loaded into the printer. But when you do so, you go to settings, image quality maintenance, and you go into color calibration. And color calibration is going to then calibrate the media, adjust the media, improve and update the media to the current state of the printer. It can also be done in Onyx. In Onyx, one of the challenges with the program that I find is that you got to delve and dig deep into the program to find anything. So at least in this particular case, there's a main menu rip queue button called recalibrate. And there's a number of options. But if you have the media loaded and you look on the printer itself and notice whatever media there, I think it's generic coated paper. So let's assume that that's the material I have in. When I click on recalibrate, it'll bring up a separate window. And that separate window is going to look something like this. So notice the printer's there. Notice the media's there. Notice the mode is there. So whatever mode you normally print in, you're going to want to recalibrate to that print mode. In most cases, when you're creating a profile, you're going to create a basic mode, which again, we see there 10p CMYK lowercase cm _90. So I can tell you that on this generic coated paper, the DPI has been set to 600. It's a 10-pass profile at a saturation level of 90. A lot of information in that mode. The only thing that's not there is the heat that's being used on the printer. But other than that, it's all listed there. And by the way, if you do get in the habit of creating profiles, I would keep a log somewhere and write down for every profile you created, the pass count, the saturation, and the heat. In the event that you have to recreate it, if you have the heat and you have the saturation and you have the pass count, you don't have to start from step 1. It'll save you time, it'll save you media just to plug those values in and advance to page number 2. And the machine's not going to like it. It's going to tell you, hey, wait a minute, you jumped ahead without worrying about step 1, but you had already entered that, so you can advance. And I don't want to get off track too much, but that is something that is recommended to keep the information, to keep the variables of your profile somewhere. In this particular case, with the media up and the mode up, there's only one option. The only option is to do an internal recalibration, and that is going to trigger the ability of Onyx to then pass steps 2 and 3 onto the printer and print those out. It's a lot easier to do it on the printer. I recommend doing it on the printer because, again, I'm all about limiting the moving parts. So if you can do it directly on the printer and the HP latex gives you that ability, then that is what I would recommend. Now, in this particular case, there's good news and bad news, and it might be the same news, I don't know. But at this point, that's pretty much all I have to provide regarding color management basics. Obviously, we can go into vast detail on this, but I'm not going to do that. Rather, what I'm going to do at this point is open things up for questions and really ask you if there's anything at all I can answer for you regarding color management in general, not just this particular presentation. Now, being that we have 35 people in the class, again, if you do have questions, be considerate, and if multiple people are unmuting, make sure that we only have one person talking. But if you know how to do this, just unmute, ask a question, and I'll be happy to answer it. If you don't, I'll go ahead and check the chat screen as well. No questions? Oh, perfect.
What do you suggest when you run across a substrate that will not let you make an ICC profile? When we use the magic backlit film, we can do the saturation, but because it's a backlit film, it won't let you profile. Is there any suggestions you have for managing the color accuracy on that, or is it just?
Well, and my recommendation, and by the way, Alexander, thank you, because that is a really valid question. What I find is that my recommendation number one is to create a profile. Textured material, backlit material, you can't do that. So what you're really relegated to is you're relegated to moving down the chain. You can't create it, so you have to obtain it. And as far as obtaining it, the first place to look is on the manufacturer or distributor's websites. Now, the challenging part of this is that you will get one of two formats, either an OMS or an OML file. And in most cases with most printers, the flow of information is from the RIP to the printer. But as far as the printer, it's so intelligent and really controls color in a profile so well that the flow of information is from the printer to the software. So basically, if you get an OML file, either off a distributor or a manufacturer site, there are ways that you can get it to work, but you actually have to create that media name exactly on the printer, download the OML file into the media manager in Onyx, and get those to link up. Sometimes it works very easily. Sometimes it's a complete headache, but that's what you have to do. Now, if you are lucky enough to get an OML file that has what's called an OMS file, a media substrate file linked to it in the proper way, bringing an OML file into Onyx works very easily. If not, it's a headache. If you can just get an OMS file itself, that can be installed in the local network of your printer. So on your design system, you would type in the proper IP address of your printer. It brings up an informative or display window for HP. And within that area, there's a media substrate or substrate media management link that allows you then to download the OMS file. And again, I don't want to go crazy here because I'm getting in depth, but I'll be more than happy to show anyone at some point how that works. I'd bring it up here, but I'm at home and I don't have the luxury of having an HP latex printer in my house. So I can't really display that here, but I'll be happy to do it after the fact with anyone. And by the way, I see a message there in, Alexander, the last thing is, if those don't work, you're kind of relegated either to finding something close that you can work with or finding the generic. that you can work with. So those would be the three scales: creation, download from a site, or using something that is existing that is close that can work for you. Joe Collins, I see a situation here. How do we know whether to increase or decrease parameters such as saturation and heat? I assume you're talking about creation. The challenging part is when you get a profile from someone else, it's kind of a fixed scenario. The saturation that's included there is based on the heat that's included there, is based on the pass count that's included there, and fiddling with any of that can challenge the integrity of the profile, and in some cases invalidate the profile. So the answer to this is that if you're creating a profile, there's one fixed element here, and that is heat. And so the answer to your question is you begin with heat because that's a tolerance that is a fixed tolerance on the printer. In general, what I can tell you is that in most vinyls, see if I can type this in. The vinyl heat, I would set at 241. Banner, 230. Oops. Paper. Honestly, that is the one thing that the HP has trouble with because of the heat involved. So I usually bring paper down to that 200 degrees or lower. And textiles or fabric, most of that can take maximum heat. But it's necessary, in fact, it's mandatory to get the heat setting correct before you move on. And there's no guide, there's no guidebook to give you a heat setting for every media, because if we're asking you to create profiles on your own, then the heat settings may be subtly different on your machines. So in this particular case, again, I'm not proposing this for profiles that you download, because I'm not proposing editing profiles you download. But if you're creating profiles, you have to start with the heat. And once you get the heat down, the saturation's easy. As much as you can get away with based on that heat, and results that you're looking for are ink that's going to dry, that isn't smeared or smudgy, ink that's not coalescing, ink that has a solid finish, and a lack of bleeding. So the highest value saturation that you can find that hits all three of those parameters is the saturation you should use. You always want to increase saturation, because the more you increase saturation, the bigger the color gamut. And there's a lot of talk, well, maybe I should reduce saturation to save ink. And that's not a valid position, because you're saving very little ink, but you're strictly, extremely limiting your color gamut. Any other questions? I like that. No questions are either one extreme or the other. Either everybody's getting this and everything's great, or everyone's totally lost. So I'm going to assume that everyone's getting this. That's great. Thank you, Brian. I appreciate it. What I will tell you is that all the sessions that I'm providing are going to be recorded. So they'll be available on the Signworld owner side, so you can hear me babble and fumble through this anytime you want. But I'm glad this was helpful for you. I appreciate your attendance. I appreciate your attendance. And you guys have a great rest of the day. As usual with everyone, stay safe. So thank you. I'm going to go ahead and end the presentation right here, and have a great day.